I thought I was just meeting my girlfriend's mom for dinner, but the way she looked at me that night, like I was more than just her daughter's boyfriend, changed everything. I still remember the first time I walked up to her house. My palms were damp against the strap of the wine bottle bag I carried, my heart beating too fast for what was supposed to be a simple dinner. I'd been dating her daughter for a few months, and while things between us were steady, meeting her mom felt like crossing into deeper territory. It was evening, one of those soft, golden evenings where the last light of the sun lingers just long enough to turn the edges of everything warm. The house itself gave off a certain kind of welcome. Pale curtains fluttered at the windows, and through the glass I caught glimpses of a cozy glow, lamps instead of harsh ceiling lights, shadows moving gently against the walls. It smelled faintly of roasted garlic and herbs when the door opened, and for a moment, I forgot every line I had practiced in my head. She stood there, her mother. 40, maybe a little more, but with the kind of grace that made age seem irrelevant. She wasn't flashy or trying too hard. Just a soft blouse tucked into dark jeans, her hair pinned back in a way that framed her face and revealed her calm, steady eyes. But it was the way she looked at me that knocked the air from my lungs. Not just polite curiosity. Not just the measured kindness of a parent meeting her child's partner. Her eyes lingered, sharp enough to notice me, soft enough to unsettle me. In that instant, I felt stripped of the titles that usually defined me: student, son, boyfriend. She looked at me like I was simply a man standing at her doorstep. "Come in," she said, her voice even, carrying a warmth that brushed against me like a familiar blanket. I stepped inside, slipping off my shoes, and immediately felt the shift. The house smelled lived in, comfortable, wood polish, faint candle wax, the faint sweetness of something baked earlier that day. The kind of atmosphere where you could breathe deeper without realizing it. Dinner was already waiting on the table, plates set neatly, glasses catching the light of the candles she'd lit. My girlfriend was in the kitchen, her voice floating from the other room, but it was her mom who guided me toward the dining space. As she walked ahead of me, her movements were unhurried, almost deliberate, like she knew exactly how to fill a room without crowding it. I tried to steady myself with small conversation, the bottle of wine in my hand, compliments about the smell of the food, but under it all, the awareness of her eyes didn't fade. When I sat down across from her at the table and she smiled, something tightened in my chest. It wasn't that she was trying to be anything more than polite. It wasn't that I was looking for something unusual. But from that very first glance, there was a current I couldn't ignore, quiet, unspoken, but undeniably there. And it was only the beginning. Dinner started off in the way you'd expect: small talk, the clink of cutlery, the faint hum of conversation between the three of us. My girlfriend was cheerful, carrying most of the conversation at first, but it didn't take long before her mom's attention shifted toward me. Not in an interrogating way, not even in the protective manner I half expected from a parent. It was gentler than that, curious, searching, almost as if she wanted to understand the kind of person I really was beneath the polite surface. "So," she asked, resting her elbow lightly on the table, "what made you choose your field of study?" It wasn't the question itself, it was the way she asked it. Not hurried. Not just filling the silence. Her eyes stayed on me as though the answer mattered. I found myself speaking more openly than I had planned, explaining my reasons, my hesitations, even the things I wasn't fully confident about. And she listened. Not nodding absent-mindedly or glancing at her phone. She listened with her whole presence. When she laughed, soft, genuine, it reached her eyes, the kind of laughter that made the room feel warmer. She'd tilt her head slightly, as if memorizing something about me. I noticed details I shouldn't have been so focused on: the faint line of concentration between her brows when she listened, the graceful way her hand circled the rim of her wine glass as if absent-mindedly tracing thoughts. My girlfriend teased me once or twice about how much I was talking, but her mom just shook her head with a small smile. "No, I like hearing him explain," she said simply, her gaze flicking back to me. And just like that, something tightened in my chest again, the strange awareness of being seen in a way I wasn't used to. The meal itself was wonderful, though I could hardly taste it at times. Every now and then I glanced up from my plate, and she would already be looking at me. Not staring, just a steady, almost contemplative glance, as though she were measuring me against something I couldn't quite name. Each time our eyes met, there was a brief pause before one of us looked away, and the pause itself said more than words could. I tried to ground myself in the ordinary, the sound of silverware against plates, the way the candles flickered whenever a draft slipped through the window, the rhythm of my girlfriend's cheerful chatter. But beneath all of that ran a quiet current I couldn't shake. It was the smallest things that carried the weight, the warmth in her voice when she said my name, the way she asked about my family and didn't rush me when I spoke, the thoughtful silence she gave before responding. It was nothing inappropriate, nothing anyone else would notice. And yet, sitting across from her, I felt a thread tightening between us, thin, delicate, but undeniably real. By the time the plates were cleared, I realized something unsettling. This wasn't just me trying to impress my girlfriend's mom. This was me trying not to think too much about the woman across the table who seemed to see straight through me. After dinner, my girlfriend excused herself to take a phone call. Something about a friend who needed advice. She stepped out of the dining room, her voice carrying down the hallway, leaving me alone at the table with her mother. For a moment, I sat there awkwardly, hands resting on my lap, uncertain whether I should stay put or make myself useful. "I'll help with the dishes," I finally said, standing before I could overthink it. She looked at me, surprised at first, and then her lips curved into the kind of smile that felt approving. "That's kind of you. Come on, then." The kitchen was smaller than the dining room, more intimate. Warm light spilled from a lamp tucked beneath the cabinets, throwing golden hues over the countertops. The smell of roasted garlic and herbs still lingered in the air, mingling with the faint citrus of dish soap waiting in the sink. We moved in quiet rhythm, her rinsing plates while I dried them. The soft clatter of porcelain, the steady hum of water, and the occasional brushing of sleeves filled the space between us. I tried to focus on the task, but the nearness of her presence was impossible to ignore. At one point, we both reached for the same plate. Her fingers brushed against mine, light, unintentional, but enough to send a jolt through me. The touch was fleeting, yet it lingered in my skin as though the warmth of her hand had seeped into me. "Sorry," she murmured, her voice low, carrying that half-smile again. "No, it's fine," I replied quickly, though my throat felt tighter than it should have. For a beat too long, neither of us moved. Just the two of us, standing shoulder to shoulder, the air between us charged in a way that was both subtle and overwhelming. Then she gently slid the plate from my hand, her fingers brushing mine again before turning to set it in the rack. I caught the faintest trace of her perfume when she leaned closer, something soft, floral, not overpowering but steady, like it belonged to her, and no one else. My chest tightened with the realization that I noticed such a detail, that I wanted to notice it. We continued working, but slower now, the silence between us carrying its own weight. I caught her glancing at me once, quickly, as though to check if I'd felt the same electricity in that accidental touch. When our eyes met briefly, I had to look away first, afraid that holding her gaze too long might reveal more than either of us was ready to admit. The moment passed quietly, but it stayed with me. Even when the last dish was set aside and the counters were wiped clean, I could still feel the ghost of her touch against my hand, as if the kitchen itself had conspired to give us a secret neither of us could speak aloud. And deep down, I knew that wasn't the last time it would happen. Later that evening, after the kitchen was quiet and the house had settled, I stepped outside to clear my head. The porch light cast a soft circle of gold against the wooden steps, and the night air wrapped around me cool and steady. Crickets hummed in the distance, and the faint rustle of leaves came with each passing breeze. I sat down on the railing, letting the silence settle into me. A moment later, the door creaked open. I turned, and there she was, holding 2 steaming cups of tea. She didn't ask if I wanted one, she simply handed it to me, as though she already knew I needed it. "I thought you might like this," she said softly, her voice carrying into the night like a thread of warmth. "Thank you," I replied, fingers brushing against hers as I took the cup. The porcelain was hot, but it was the brief warmth of her touch that made my pulse stumble. She leaned against the post across from me, cradling her own cup, her eyes drifting toward the garden as if it were easier than looking directly at me. "It's strange," she began quietly, "watching your children grow up. One moment you're tying their shoes, and the next, they're bringing someone home for dinner." She gave a small laugh, but it carried a note of wistfulness. I listened, not daring to interrupt. "I keep telling myself it's a good thing," she continued, "that it means I did something right. But sometimes," she paused, sipping her tea, "sometimes it just feels like life is slipping past faster than I know how to hold on to it." Her words weren't rehearsed or casual. They came from a place of quiet vulnerability, and I felt honored she would share them with me. "I think," I said carefully, "that means you raised her well. You gave her the kind of foundation that lets her move forward without fear." She looked at me then, really looked, her eyes shining in the glow of the porch light, softer now, unguarded. "You're kind to say that." We stood in silence for a moment, sipping tea, the night pressing close around us. Then, gently, almost without thought, she reached out and touched my wrist. Her fingers were light, a simple connection, but it carried weight far beyond its simplicity. I didn't move. My chest tightened, my breath stilled. The world felt narrowed down to that single point of contact, her hand against my skin, her eyes holding mine with something unspoken. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "For being good to her." Her words were for her daughter, but her touch said something else entirely. Something that neither of us could put into words. And in that stillness, beneath the soft hum of crickets and the glow of the porch light, I realized this was no longer just about meeting my girlfriend's mom. This was about standing at the edge of something neither of us should want, yet neither of us could completely deny. The memory of that porch lingered in me long after the night ended. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the way her hand had rested on my wrist, or the way her voice carried an undertone she hadn't meant to reveal. It haunted me quietly, a weight I couldn't name. The next time I visited, I told myself it would be different. That I'd draw lines, that I'd forget the flicker of something between us. And for the most part, the evening was ordinary. My girlfriend chatted, we ate together, we laughed. But beneath the surface, there it was again, that subtle awareness whenever her mom entered the room, whenever her gaze brushed over me just a fraction longer than necessary. Later that night, after my girlfriend stepped away to grab something from her room, I found myself alone in the living room with her mother. The television murmured faintly in the background, casting soft flashes of light across the room, but neither of us was paying attention to it. She sat beside me on the couch, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. At first, it was nothing, just two people sharing a sofa. But the longer we sat there, the more I noticed the details. The way her knee angled slightly toward me. The warmth radiating from her body, so close it seemed to reach through the inches of space between us. I shifted slightly, trying to focus on the program, but when my arm brushed against hers, I felt it again, that spark. She didn't move away. Instead, she let the contact linger, small and unspoken, as though either of us had the courage to acknowledge it. The silence grew heavier. My heart picked up, beating so loudly it felt like it filled the room. I turned my head, and she was already looking at me. Not with polite curiosity this time, but with something deeper, something rawer. Her breath caught softly, barely audible, and in that instant the world seemed to tilt. My hand twitched on the couch cushion, caught between restraint and the overwhelming pull to close the distance. I could feel the nearness of her hand, inches from mine, the warmth of her presence pulling me in like gravity. We didn't speak. We didn't move. But everything in that moment screamed of what might happen if one of us leaned even the slightest bit closer. And then, footsteps. The sound of my girlfriend coming back down the hall shattered the silence like glass. We both pulled back instantly, her mother adjusting her posture, me clearing my throat as though I'd simply been distracted by the television. By the time my girlfriend walked into the room, the moment was buried beneath a layer of normalcy. But as I glanced sideways at her mom, I caught it, the faintest flush in her cheeks, the way she avoided my eyes as though looking at me would undo all the careful distance she just rebuilt. We hadn't crossed the line, but we had come dangerously close. And the weight of what almost happened hung in the air long after the moment had passed. After that night on the couch, everything changed, though on the surface, nothing did. I kept visiting, kept acting like the considerate boyfriend my girlfriend believed me to be. But beneath the polite smiles and casual conversation, there was a quiet tension that neither of us could ignore. Her mother had returned to her composed self, the warm, soft humor she usually carried now tempered by a subtle wariness. When I caught her eyes, she would look away first, but not without a flicker, a fleeting spark that said more than words ever could. I knew she remembered that night, remembered the moment when the boundaries almost dissolved. And I couldn't stop thinking about it either. We began interacting more cautiously. She would offer me a cup of tea with her usual grace, but this time her hands would linger just a fraction less, or she would tilt her head as though measuring how close she could get without crossing the invisible line. I noticed the restraint in her gestures, in the warmth of her glances, in the carefully measured softness of her voice. Every interaction was charged with unspoken acknowledgement. I struggled with my own feelings. I felt guilt, confusion, and an undeniable pull toward her that I could not ignore. Every laugh, every brief touch, every accidental brush of our arms carried the weight of unspoken longing. At the same time, there was an honesty to it, a silent recognition that neither of us wanted to act on, yet neither of us could fully suppress. Even ordinary conversations became layered with meaning. She asked about my day, my plans, my thoughts on trivial and serious matters alike, and I could feel her truly listening, more deeply than anyone else had before. I noticed how her eyes softened when I spoke, how her smile carried an unspoken weight, and how the briefest pause between her words seemed to invite me into a space of shared understanding. Sometimes I caught myself staring at her for a fraction too long, feeling that same strange pull I had felt on the porch and in the kitchen. And each time, I sensed she felt it too. Not with boldness, not with overt desire, but with a quiet, knowing awareness. The tension between us was like a delicate wire stretched taut, dangerous if pulled too far, yet impossible to ignore. There were fleeting moments when she would brush a strand of hair behind her ear or adjust a sleeve near my hand, small gestures loaded with subtle intimacy. And when our eyes met, even for a second, it was enough to make my pulse jump, my chest tighten, and my mind fill with the unspoken, we both know. By now, I understood that this was no longer just about curiosity or temptation. It was a mutual recognition of something profound, something that neither of us could name, yet both of us could feel. It wasn't a crossing of boundaries, but a silent acknowledgement that our connection was real, complicated, and undeniable. And in that quiet understanding, I realized that some of the strongest bonds are forged not by words, but by the weight of what is felt and left unsaid. The final night at her house arrived quietly, almost unremarkably. I had come over for another dinner, hoping to keep things light and ordinary, but I knew, deep down, that nothing would feel ordinary again. There was a tension in the air, subtle but undeniable, a quiet current that hummed beneath every laugh, every shared glance. When the evening wound down, my girlfriend excused herself to take a late call, leaving me alone with her mother once more. This time, we didn't speak immediately. We simply lingered near the front door, each of us aware of the space we were occupying, yet neither daring to break it. The porch light cast a soft glow over her features, highlighting the gentle curve of her cheek, the calm strength in her eyes, and the vulnerability that she let only me see. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice low and steady. "Not for the tea, not for the dishes, not even for the dinner, but for who I had been during my time in her home, and for the way I had treated her daughter." Her hand reached out instinctively, brushing briefly against my arm. The contact was fleeting, yet it held more weight than any words could convey. For a moment I felt everything, the longing, the restraint, the quiet awareness of the connection that had grown between us. Her hand was warm against mine, steady, grounding, and I could sense the hesitation behind her calm exterior. Either of us spoke. There was no need. The silence said everything. I began, then stopped, realizing that some things are too complex to voice, that some truths are better carried quietly within the heart. She gave me a small, knowing smile, her eyes soft but firm. I know, she said simply, and in that one word she acknowledged what had passed between us and what could never be acted upon. She stepped back, releasing my arm, but the imprint of her touch lingered in my skin, in my chest, in my mind. We held each other's gaze for a long, quiet moment, a final acknowledgement of the connection we both felt but could not pursue. The air between us was heavy with unspoken desire, but also with understanding, a recognition that some bonds are meant to be cherished quietly, without crossing lines that would hurt others or ourselves. When I finally turned to leave, she stepped aside, her hand briefly lingering on the door frame. I paused, taking one last look at her face, the warmth, the strength, the vulnerability, and realized that this moment, this fleeting connection, would stay with me far longer than any casual memory. As I walked away, the night air cool against my skin, I carried a mix of melancholy and gratitude. I had glimpsed something extraordinary in her, a depth of understanding, a warmth, a quiet desire that had touched me in ways I hadn't anticipated. And though it would never become anything more than what it was, I knew that her look, her touch, and her presence would remain with me indefinitely, shaping the way I understood connection, restraint, and longing. Some connections, I realized, are meant to be felt and never fully realized. And that, in itself, is a kind of beauty. As I walked away that night, I realized some connections are felt more deeply than they are acted upon, and some memories stay with us forever. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss more slow-burn romances like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt a connection that was impossible to explain?